Looks peaceful here in the country, doesn't it? And it seems a long way from the guns of the battlefront. But these broad fields are at war, and the farmers here, as in every other part of the country, are very much in the fight. From fields like these, they are producing the food we need to win the war, more food than they ever produced before. To get this added production, more farmers each year are turning to a new kind of agriculture called soil conservation farming, which saves soil and water, seed and fertilizer. The result has been a 20% increase in yield per acre, as an average, on thousands of conservation farms from coast to coast. 20% is a real jump, and worthwhile anytime, but especially nowadays. Here in York County, Chris Musser farms 102 acres. At harvest time one year, he began thinking about soil conservation. By harvest time the next year, he had made the change, and despite a drought, was harvesting a bumper crop for a nation at war. This is the story of that year, from harvest to harvest. Spring Run Farm is a family farm, and it's been that way from the beginning. Chris Musser is head of the family, thinking carefully, working hard. But then everybody works at Spring Run. Mrs. Musser has her jobs too. And so does Chris Jr. and Gordon, Paul, Alvin, and the twins, Mary and Martha. Yes, everybody has always worked at Spring Run, and out of the land, the men and women have made a good living for themselves and their children. A good living and a big, comfortable home, now nearly a century old, and other solid buildings rooted firmly in the good earth. In the fields, there's time for a lot of thinking, and that's what Chris Musser was doing at harvest time that year, shortly after the war began. Crops were pretty good, all right, but not good enough for wartime, and the soil was getting thin in spots. He knew that some of his neighbors had taken to plowing across their sloping land, along the contour, to save soil and water, and their crops had turned out better, too. But as a boy, Chris had learned to plow a straight row, straight as an arrow. It's hard to break an old habit like this, even when you know that straight rows waste your land and hurt it. With every hard rain, the water pours downhill, down the rows, and washes soil along with it. Sooner or later, that means trouble. Off and on during the winter, Chris kept thinking about his land, whether he should change over to soil conservation methods, whether it would really help him get more production. So when he would take the vegetables and eggs and butter to town, he got into the habit of asking friends and neighbors about conservation. Like any good farmer, Chris wanted to find out all he could about the new methods before he tried them out. In the evenings, Chris worked long hours at his desk. There were records to keep, plans to make for the year ahead. He read reports on conservation farming, too, how it was done and how it increased production, for production is the big farm job always. All the rest of the winter, as he worked in the woods, Chris was thinking of his snow-covered land, picturing his fields with the new rows on the contour and the strip cropping, and he was counting, too, on the better production he would get through soil conservation. There's always something fresh and clean about spring, every time it comes around. The sun is warm and friendly. It feels good. The very air seems to be charged with a new life, and a zest for living and growing is everywhere. There are 1,000 jobs to do in the spring, too. And on the farm, it seems as though all of them have to be done at the same time. There's machinery that has to be made ready, and there are potatoes that need to be cut for planting. By the middle of April, the ground was ready to work. Melvin Blish, the Soil Conservation Service technician, was on hand with a conservation map of the farm, a map which he and Chris had worked out earlier, which showed the kind of soil, the slope and erosion, and the conservation needs of every field. Chris had taken the first 2 steps in soil conservation. He had learned the facts about his land, and he had decided to put each acre into the kind of crop it was best suited to produce, whether that be grass or grain, row crops or trees. Marking off contour lines came next, and that required a level. A small pocket model would do. Some farmers use a carpenter's level. It doesn't have to be shiny or expensive. To prove it, Chris had made a very good level out of wood and 2 screw eyes. The horizontal bar was nailed at right angles to the longer hanging bar, and the whole device swung freely on a round wooden pin made from a broomstick handle. Simple, isn't it? The whole business of contouring is simple. All you need is a good eye, a level, a few dozen stakes, and somebody to help place them. Here's how Chris did it. Beginning at the side of the field, the first stake was driven into the ground. Then Gordon, with a few more stakes, paced off about 30 feet across the field at right angles to the downward slope. Holding one of the stakes, he faced back toward his father. And Chris, sighting along the top of his homemade level, waved him first to the right and then back a bit until he could see the peak of Gordon's cap in a direct line through the 2 screw eyes. That was the spot for the second marker. Then, with Chris moving over to the second stake and Gordon pacing off another 30 feet across the field, they began the same process all over again. It didn't take long. Within an hour, the stakes marking the first contour row were in the ground. Furrows running along this line would be level all the way across the field. Level rows act as little dams, each one slowing the downhill movement of soil and water. And that's the object of contouring, to keep water from pouring downhill every time it rains. By slowing the water, you prevent the soil, seed, and fertilizer from washing away. And when you do that, your crops are bound to be better. It isn't necessary to place stakes for every contour row. On gently rolling land like this, you only need to sight, stake out the contour, about once in each 100 feet of slope. And once the contour line is marked out, you can plow a furrow or 2 along the stakes as a guide and then pull them out for the next line. Plowing or any other operation along the contour isn't hard at all. Most farmers find it saves time, saves fuel, because there's less gear shifting. Operations are easier on the contour. Laying out the contour rows didn't interfere with spring planting at all. As soon as the weather was right, Chris was ready to go ahead with potato planting, liming, and all the other springtime jobs. And then, almost before he knew it, spring was turning into summer, and the garden was flourishing. For the first time in years, Chris was taking a crop from land that had lost little or no soil, seed, or fertilizer in the spring rains. There had been no replanting to do either, and that had meant savings in time, labor, and money. Where the soil had been wearing thin under straight rows of corn, thick-growing barley across the slope now held the soil in place. The contour rows of potatoes and soybeans were coming along very nicely. And on the steepest land, too steep to cultivate, hay had taken the place of row crops. There's no more erosion here. In the cornfield, contour rows were holding back water so it could be stored in the soil for the young crop. Peaches, 500 bushels of them. Where's the cream, Mrs. Musser? Nobody goes hungry on the farm, especially when there's a good garden. Even after most of the fruits and vegetables have gone to market, there's plenty for canning. Looks good, but I'll bet it tastes even better. In wartime, we need more milk and butter. Chris was producing more of both. And 1,500 more broilers. More soybeans, too. With water stored in the soil by conservation, corn production went up. Even though rainfall was less than half of normal, Chris got more corn from 28 acres this year than he did from 33 acres last year. The potato fields told the same story. Precious water stored in the soil brought the crop through in fine shape, well above the county average. Well, that's the story. Chris Musser and Spring Run Farm happen to be in Pennsylvania, but almost the same story could be told about farmers and the land in Georgia or Minnesota, Oregon or Utah, Arkansas or Nebraska. All over the country, soil conservation is increasing production, increasing it now when we need it most. And soil conservation is protecting our land against erosion, conserving it for our own use and our children's use for years to come.